The event was a famous one. I would later learn like a wounded knee or wacko, but when my father first told us the story, it felt like no one in the world knew about it except us. It began near the end of canning season, which other kids probably call summer. My family always spent the warm months bottling fruit for storage, which Dad said we'd need in the days of abomination. One evening, Dad was uneasy when he came in from the junkyard. He paced the kitchen during dinner, hardly touching a bite. We had to get everything in order, he said. There was little time. We spent the next day boiling and skinning peaches. By sundown, we'd filled dozens of mason jars, which were set out in perfect rows, still warm from the pressure cooker. Dad surveyed our work, counting the jars and muttering to himself. Then he turned to Mother and said, "It's not enough." That night, Dad called a family meeting and we gathered around the kitchen table, because it was wide and long and could seat all of us. We had a right to know what we were up against, he said. He was standing at the head of the table, the rest of us perched on benches, studying the thick plank of red oak. "There's a family not far from here," Dad said. "They are freedom fighters. They won't let the government brainwash their kids in their public school. So the feds came after them." Dad exhaled, long and slow. "The feds surrounded the family's cabin, kept them locked in there for weeks. And when a hungry child or little boy snuck out to go hunting, the feds shot him dead." I scanned my brothers. I'd never seen fear on Luke's face before. "They're still in the cabin," Dad said. "They keep the lights off and they crawl on the floor, away from the doors and windows. I don't know how much food they got. Might be they'll starve before the feds give up." No one spoke. Eventually, Luke, who was 12, asked if we would help. "No," Dad said. "Nobody can. They are trapped in their own home. But they got their guns. You can bet that's why the feds aren't charged in." He paused to sit, folding himself onto the low bench in slow, stiff movements. He looked old to my eyes, worn out. "We can't help them, but we can help ourselves. When the feds come to Buck's Peak, we'll be ready." That night, Dad dragged a pile of old army bags up from the basement. He said they were our head for the hail bags. We spent that night packing them with supplies, herbal medicines, water purifiers, flint and steel. Dad had bought several boxes of military MREs, meals ready to eat, and we put as many as we could fit into our packs, imagining the moment when having the feds in the house and hiding ourselves in the wild plum trees near the creek. We'd eat them. Some of my brothers stowed guns in their packs, but I had only a small knife, and even so, my pack was as big as me by the time we were finished. I asked Luke to hoist it onto a shelf in my closet, but Dad told me to keep it low where I could fetch it quick, so I slept with it in my bed. I practiced slipping the bag onto my back and running with it. I didn't want to be left behind. I imagined our escape, a midnight flight to the safety of the princess. The mountain, I understood, was our ally. To those who knew her, she could be kind, but to intruders, she was pure treachery. And this would give us an advantage. Then again, if we were going to take over on the mountain when the feds came, I didn't understand why we were canning all these peaches. We couldn't haul 1,000 heavy mason jars up the peak. Or didn't we need the peaches so we could bunker down in the house like the weavers or fight it out? Fighting it out seemed likely, especially a few days later when Dad came home with more than a dozen military surplus rifles, mostly SKS. Their thin silver bayonets folded neatly under their barrels. The guns arrived in narrow tin boxes and were packed in cosmoline, a brownish substance, the consistency of lard that had to be stripped away. After they'd been cleaned, my brother Tyler chose one and set it on a sheet of black plastic, which he folded over the rifle, sealing it with yards of silver duct tape. Hoisting the bundle onto his shoulder, he carried it down the hill and dropped it next to the red railway car. Then he began to dig. When the hole was wide and deep, he dropped the rifle into it, and I watched him cover it with dirt, his muscles swelling from the exertion, his jaw clenched. Soon after, Dad bought a machine to manufacture bullets from spent cartridge. "Now we could last longer in a standoff," he said. I thought of my head for the Hughes bag waiting in my bed and of the rifle hidden near the rail car, and began to worry about the bullet-making machine. It was bulky and bolted to an iron workstation in the basement. If we were taken by surprise, I figured we wouldn't have time to fetch it. I wondered if we could bury it too, with a rifle. We kept on bottling peaches. I don't understand how many days passed or how many jars we added to our stores before Dad told us more of the story. Randy Weaver's been shot, Dad said, his voice thin and erratic. He left the cabin to fetch his son's body and the feds shot him. I'd never seen my father cry, but now tears were dripping in a steady stream from his nose. He didn't wipe them, just let them spill onto his shirt. His wife heard the shot and ran to the window, holding their baby. Then came the second shot. Mother was sitting with her arms folded, one hand across her chest, the other clamped over her mouth. I stared at her speckled linoleum while Dad told us how the baby had been lifted from his mother's arm, his face smeared with her blood. Until that moment, some part of me had wanted the feds to come, had craved the adventure. Now I felt real fear. I pictured my brothers crouching in the dark, their sweaty hands slipping down their rifles. I pictured Mother tired and parched, drawing back away from the window. I pictured myself lying flat on the floor, still and silent, listening to the sharp chirp of crickets in the field. Then I saw Mother stand and reach for the kitchen tap. A white flash, the roar of gunfire, and she fell. I leaped to catch the baby. Dad never told us the end of the story. We didn't have a TV or radio, or perhaps he never learned how it ended himself. The last thing I remember him saying about it was, "Next time, it could be us." Those words would stay with me. I would hear their echo in the chirp of crickets, in the squish of peaches dropping into a glass jar, in the metallic chink of an SKS being cleaned. I would hear them every morning when I passed a railroad car and paused over the chickweed and bowl thistle growing where Tyler had buried the rifle. Long after Dad had forgotten about the revelation in Isaiah, and Mother was again hefting plastic jugs of Weston Family 2% into the fridge, I would remember the Weavers. It was almost 5 a.m. I returned to my room, my head full of crickets and gunfire. In the lower bunk, Audrey was snoring, a low, contented hum that invited me to do the same. Instead, I climbed up to my bed, crossed my legs, and looked out the window. 5 passed, then 6. At 7, Grandma appeared, and I watched her pace up and down her patio, turning every few moments to gaze up the hill at our house. Then she and Grandpa stepped into their car and pulled onto the highway. When the car was gone, I got out of bed and ate a bowl of bran with water. Outside, I was greeted by Luke's goat, Kimikaze, who nibbled my shirt as I walked the barn. I passed the go-kart Richard was building from an old lawnmower. I slaughtered the pigs, filled the trough, and moved Grandpa's horses to a new pasture. After I'd finished, I climbed the railway car and looked out over the valley. It was easy to pretend the car was moving, speeding away, that at any moment the valley might disappear behind me. I'd spent hours playing that fantasy through my head, but today, the real wouldn't take. I turned west, away from the fields, and faced the peak. The princess was always brightest in spring, just after the conifers emerged from the snow, their deep green needles seeming almost black against the tawny brown of soil and bark. It was autumn now. I could still see her, but she was fading. The reds and yellows of a dying summer obscured her dark form. Soon it would snow. In the valley, that first snow would melt, but on the mountain, it would linger, burying the princess until spring, when she would reappear, watchful.